Right, I think we'll make a start. We've a lot of people have registered for the webinar, and I suspect a few people will join us as once we have started. Um, for those who didn't hear me at the beginning, my name's William Baker. I'm a trustee of the Fuel Poverty Research Network. And for those of you who are not familiar with the network, uh, our aim is to bring together students, researchers, policymakers, and other professionals concerned with fuel poverty. We support the development of a vibrant community that gathers evidence, informs policy, and advocates for action to reduce the level of fuel poverty. And we do this by providing grants for early career researchers and practitioners, organising opportunities for discussion and debate, like the one today, and disseminating and promoting the work of a diverse and international research community in order to share learning and opportunities. So today's webinar is going to focus on how energy prices in the UK could be reformed to make energy more affordable for everybody. Just to give some context, in October 2020, the price cap for a household with average energy consumption was just over £1,000. By August 2023, the price cap has increased to 2,074, effectively double the 2020 figure. So furthermore, the government's energy bill support scheme, which provided a £400 rebate to all consumers last winter, has not been continued this year. And of course, we've just heard that Ofgem has announced a price cap increase of a further £100 on average. And this would take place in January. So this would undoubtedly exacerbate hardship and further increase already high levels of fuel debt. We hear from advice agencies of unprecedented levels of demand for help, and demand for emergency fuel vouchers, for example, vastly outpacing supply. So not surprisingly, fuel poverty has grown dramatically as a result. NEA estimates that there are now 6.3 million households in fuel poverty in the UK. So many are referring to the current situation as an energy crisis, a crisis that has led to many households cutting back on their energy use to dangerous levels or even not using energy at all. And of course, we also face a climate crisis. I was struck by Oxfam's recent research, which clearly shows that the worst culprits are with respect to carbon emissions, namely the rich and super rich. So at the global level, the richest 1% emit as much carbon pollution as 2/3 of the rest of humanity. They cancel out the carbon savings from nearly 1 million wind turbines. The carbon emissions from the richest 10% are nearly 10 times higher than the global 1.5 degree compatible per capita level, while the per capita emissions of the poorest 10% are way below this level. So similar inequalities in carbon emissions take place in the UK. The richest 1% now hold more wealth than 70% of Britons, and the consumption of energy is continuing to grow. So I think key issues for today's webinar include: can tariff reform address the energy profligacy of the rich, as well as making energy more affordable for low-income households? How might any costs associated with reforms be funded by the Treasury, by energy companies, by consumers, or a mix of all three? How do we make sure energy affordability is improved for those worst affected by the energy crisis? What are the implications for eligibility criteria and targeting? And finally, how do we achieve change? What are the respective roles of government, the regulator, the energy industry, and of equal importance, civil society? So to address some of these issues, we have four excellent speakers who will talk about their proposals for tariff reform. Brenda Boardman from the Energy Climate Environmental Change Institute, David Southgate from Age UK, Alex Chapman from New Economics Foundation, and Ruth London from Fuel Poverty Action. They each would talk for about 10-15 minutes, and we'll have about a few minutes after each presentation for questions to the speaker about the proposals. But please use the chat function at any point during the presentation to ask your question. Or you can raise your virtual hand using the reactions function in Zoom, and we'll unmute you to allow you to ask your question direct to the speaker. And following the four presentations, we have allowed some time for a general discussion about the different proposals and how reform might be achieved. We would welcome your input to this final session. So without further ado, I'll introduce the first speaker, Brenda Boardman, probably well known to many of you. She's an emeritus fellow at the Environmental Change Institute following her retirement, in theory, in 2008. Between 1991 and 2008, Brenda led the energy group at the ECI. She's renowned for extensive research on fuel poverty, including 2 trailblazing books, and her passion for identifying and campaigning for policy solutions to fuel poverty. Most recently, Brenda and her colleagues provided the research that underpinned the widely supported call for an emergency tariff to protect low-income consumers this winter. Over to you, Brenda. You're still on mute, Brenda.
Thank you, William. What I'm going to do today is talk about our proposals, the research that we did from the ECI and with Cambridge Architectural Research. I've shown you the cover on the right-hand side and the title. So if you want to see that, please look for it. It was research into those households that have got prepayment meters for both electricity and gas. It was over 11,000 households in our final sample, and these were all customers of Utilita, and Utilita supported us in both funding the research and providing the data. But today I'm just talking about our proposals, though it's obviously based partly on those findings. And I absolutely confirm that what we found was that fuel poverty is getting worse, as William has just said. Next slide, please. Now, what all of you have got to do today is to look at the following issues and the extent to which the 4 of us managed to address them. So there's how much money and how should it be given. There's who should get it, whether that's through income, social characteristics, energy consumption, and who pays, Treasury, suppliers, energy suppliers, or other customers, and with the how much and how. It could be a lump sum, or it could be through the energy bill to reflect use. Thank you. Next slide. Now that's what all 4 of us have got to address. What I'm going to do today is look at what we took to be the basic problem, that the unit cost of electricity and gas is too high. At the same time, we have got the energy company profits being absolutely excessive, not just profits, but excessive profits. So what we wanted to do is find a way of reducing the flow of money that has been taking place from us, the consumers, to them, the energy companies. And we did it in the context of wanting to have a solution for this winter. We did the research between June and August, and we were hoping very much to try and get a scheme, an emergency scheme, ready for this winter, which we've not yet achieved. Thank you. Next slide. We're still trying what this is all part of. So the first issue is how, and we believe it should go into the energy accounts. The government keeps saying it's giving a lot of support to people, which it is, but it's for the cost of living. So there's 8 million households getting support via means-tested benefits, and that goes into their bank account. It's for food, it's for rent, school uniforms, getting to work, etc., etc. Almost none of it is being used for energy in the home. What our proposal is not to put it through means-tested benefit and not to put it into a bank account. What we want to do is help fuel poverty through the energy accounts directly and automatically. Thank you. The next issue is, should it be cash or should it be a unit rate? We have 2 types of prepayment meters at the moment in Britain. They collectively go to about 4.5 million households, so it's a lot of people. A legacy prepayment meter is one that uses a card, and you must go and charge that card up at the petrol station, kiosk, or wherever when you want to put more money on it. The energy suppliers cannot give a cash or lump sum to anybody with a legacy prepayment meter. You've got to be there at the counter with the card. And that's about half of all prepayment meters. And that's why last winter we had fuel vouchers giving out the £400 energy bill support scheme payment to the people on a legacy prepayment meter. However, the suppliers can remotely alter the unit rate for all tariffs, including legacy prepayment meters. It's a very easy, well, I don't know that it's easy, but it's a process they're now used to doing, and they can do it in 5 weeks. They have to do it in 5 weeks every time a new cap is announced. So our recommendation is that the money is given, allocated to the fuel poor through the unit rate, not through a cash sum. So it's reflective of actual use of the household. Thank you. The question then is about how much to give. There are two routes to answering that question. In our research, we looked at the way in which the energy bill support scheme and the £400, which was put onto people's electricity bills over last winter, that halved self-disconnection with our sample, all of whom, as I said, are smart prepayment meter users. It did not stop people running out of money and self-disconnecting. So the £400 was not sufficient. So we believe it should be more than that. So we've said 500. Now, the average household in Britain spends approximately the same amount of money on electricity as on gas. So the £500, no, don't go back. That's it, thanks. The £500 for electricity would be matched by another £500 for gas to give £1,000 in total. And as William has just said, the lowest cap in 2020 was 1,042. From the 5th of January, at the same rates of consumption as took place in October 2020, Ofgem have now lowered those, it would be 2,023, excuse me. So in both cases, we're trying to give a benefit worth £1,000 to households through the unit rates that existed in October 2020. Sorry, keep going. Sorry about this, everybody. Who is eligible is probably the most difficult question that any of us have got to answer. And there is no clear, easy, good answer. But what we're trying to do, partly for speed and partly to get a more accurate approach, is to deal with what the energy supplier already knows. So we would make everybody on a prepayment meter, that's the 4.5 million that I've already mentioned, eligible. The warm home discount recipients, it's a government scheme. It's based on a means-tested benefits and other conditions, but it is paid direct to the energy account. It's a somewhat measly £150 at the moment, and about 3 million households are thought under the present scheme to be eligible, so we'd include them. One of the things that we found was that all our households had electricity and gas, but we found a lot of households, quite a lot of households, about 600 out of our 11,000, where they had virtually no gas use. They might be using it for a gas hob, but they were definitely not using gas for heating. They had effectively switched off their gas heating, and therefore they were using electricity to try and heat the home. They weren't doing that at all successfully because they weren't consuming enough. But we are very worried about that group, and we would therefore make them eligible for help, because and we'd identify them by saying that electricity is the main metered fuel. Gas is there, but it's a smaller amount, which is not what you'd expect. And the household will be using less than 4,200 kilowatt hours of electricity a year. That's based on Ofgem's declaration for what they think is needed for an economy 7 rate. It is surprisingly low, but it has some official status. We've no idea how many households this is, but we've guessed at 1 million. The final category is those that are on the Priority Services Register. This is a register that each supplier already has. It's a list of those people to contact if there is a blackout or an emergency or something goes wrong with the supply generally. It's elderly, young, babies, households with babies, people with medical conditions, etc. We found a lot of the households that are on the Priority Service Register are still self-disconnecting. We aren't doing enough to help them keep going with their daily expenditure, even if they are on a list for emergency help. So anybody who's on the PSR but with a medical condition, maybe they may be charging a wheelchair, they may need a fridge for insulin, they may need a hoist, they may have some rather more sophisticated machinery that depends on electricity, for instance, for dialysis. Again, we don't know the number, but we've estimated it's about 1 million. In total, that's 9.5 million, but we think there's quite considerable overlap. So once you reduce the double counting, we think that about 8 million households would be eligible. Thank you. So our proposal is that all the fuel poor, those 8 million households that we've just identified, would be put onto the tariff rate that existed in October 2020. That's 3.5p per kilowatt hour for gas, 12.5p per kilowatt hour for electricity. This will halve the amount that they should be paying. So it will get them back to 1,042, not the rate that it'll exist at the same amount of consumption from January the 5th of 2023. We would be effectively saving them, if they were on this typical consumption, £1,000. It goes directly onto the energy account. It helps with fuel costs. We're aiming for 8 million households. We're aiming for support of about £1,000. So that is £8 billion. At the moment, the government has over £8 billion in their accounts for the present financial year, which was put there for the energy price guarantee and is now not going to be needed. So for the present year, the money is there. And officially, I mean, this is our emergency scheme. We called it the Energy Cost Support Scheme, and that's our proposal so far. And last slide, please, Graham. Going forward, partly because this winter, unfortunately, is slipping away from us, we would fund this scheme not through that 8 billion, because that's there just for the 1 year, but through a thing called the Green Power Pool. This has been investigated, research, devised by University College London, Michael Grubb and his colleagues. This is because the electricity from renewable energy sources is cheaper than electricity from fossil fuels. So if you subdivide the market, the energy market for electricity, into the green power pool, which would be cheap and clean, from that market, which is the same as now, which is fossil fuels and dirty and expensive. And then we would propose that from next winter onwards, the fuel poor get the green power pool, so they have cheaper electricity. To, excuse me, in going forward, and it couldn't be done in 1 year, unfortunately, but to make sure that the fuel poor also are not having to use expensive gas, we would have a scheme that would emphasize fuel poor homes being insulated, given heat pumps, and then each fuel poor household would only be using cheap electricity. Fuel poverty wouldn't be completely abolished, but it would certainly be under control. And who's paying for that? Initially, it would be from the renewable electricity suppliers, who at the moment are getting a large amount of excess, almost excess profits, and they wouldn't be under this scheme. They would just be getting the costs that they would bid for under the CFD, which is the contracts for difference. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. Just if I can use my position as chair, a couple of questions that occurred to me was people with, I wasn't quite sure how people with electricity only, or those you were mentioning use only small amounts of gas, would get the £500. How would they get the £1,000 rather than just the £500 through the electricity supply? And then just the second question I wondered is, obviously a lot of us were very disappointed that there wasn't anything in the autumn statement. When do you think the next opportunity might arise to introduce this scheme?
We haven't investigated in great detail the answer to your first question. I think though all electric homes would get the £1,000. The extent to which there would have to be a different category other than the 4,200 kilowatt hours, I'm not sure. It might be that we know enough about those. One of our difficulties was that we only had this data. We didn't have detailed data on people on other tariffs. In terms of the autumn statement, heartbreaking it wasn't included. I have no idea when the next opportunity is going to occur. I don't think it's going to be an official government one. I'm hoping that it might well be general pressure from the population, and particularly if we have a spell of cold weather, which we're meant to be getting sort of imminently, and representatives of the health service, because the health service is already struggling. And every time there's a cold winter, they struggle even more. And this winter, we're all quite convinced in the sort of fuel poverty lobby that this winter is going to be the worst of all. Fuel poor have lost their resilience. If they had a little bit of money saved up in a bank account, and that's quite a big if, that's all gone. If they had a little bit of money that was extra on their direct debits with the suppliers, that's all gone. And everybody is just struggling even more, we believe. So there is the possibility that really cold weather could result in some horrendous numbers needing the health service to support them, and that might focus government minds. And as I said, the suppliers can introduce this in 5 weeks. They do it within 5 weeks already. Yeah. They have to, so it could be done quite quickly. Thank you.
So we've got some questions in the chat section. So Kevin Shields, from the Northern Ireland Utility Regulator has asked, how did you measure those self-disconnecting who were on the PSR Priority Service Register?
We knew who was on the PSR because Utilita include that in the data, as almost all utilities have to, I think, but Utilita certainly did. We took 5 minutes as the self-disconnection. We had a lot of debate about what equaled a self-disconnection, but actually it made very little difference whether we took 5 minutes, 10 minutes or 20 minutes. Most people on a prepayment meter know when the money's running out. They're very well aware of that. With a smart prepayment meter, which is all of our sample, they've got the opportunity on their phone to press a button, put more money in from the bank into the energy account, and it can be done in a couple of seconds. So 5 minutes it sounded too short, but it didn't seem to make a huge amount of difference. So self-disconnection was 5 minutes plus.
Okay. Question from Kirsten Jenkins, I think from University of Edinburgh. But of those 8 million households, do you have a sense of how many of them would be in Scotland? And she asked because of their different fuel poverty definition, higher prices, higher rates of unregulated fuel use, electricity-only households, and poor rates of energy efficiency, etc.
Cambridge Architectural Research did a separate study for Scotland because we had very few people from Scotland in the database that we looked at, and because we realized that the conditions up there are different. So if you look on our website or Cambridge Architectural Research website, you'll find there is a Scottish study with some special data for them.
Okay, thank you. Jenny Brierley, a fellow trustee, has asked, what obstacles stand in the way of pricing green power and fossil fuel power differently?
Say that, stand in the way of what, William?
Separating out green power from fossil fuel power, pricing them differently.
A lot of electricity suppliers who don't want to lose their profits, their excess profits, and unfortunately Ofgem, who seem to take an inordinate amount of time to redesign anything. It actually could be about it as part of the energy market reform, because that implies months, if not years, and this could be done very quickly. About, if I remember correctly, about half of our electricity that comes from renewables is all, and that's 40% of the total. About half of that, I think, is covered by contracts for difference. So there's a lot out there. You could very easily work with those companies. They have already entered a contract with the government to supply electricity at those reduced prices. They're tiny in comparison with the market cost. I mean, a quarter or something like that. There are a lot of other people providing renewable electricity through historic contracts, and it could be that there's a marketing exercise, though, that those companies get involved and incorporated into the green power pool and introduce more people into it and enlarge that. The amount of electricity from renewables is more than sufficient to cope with this scheme.
Okay, thank you. There's some questions coming thick and fast. Neil Simcock has asked, given the large number of people who are eligible but don't claim warm home discounts and are not on the priority service register, even though they are eligible, how do you try to make sure the help reaches those households? I mean,
because it's the supplier automatically saying to them, you're getting it. They don't have to apply, because the information we are basing our eligibility on is already in the hands of the suppliers. They know who's on the PSR. They know who is getting warm homes discount. They know who is using relatively or tiny amounts of electricity, even though they've got gas, and they know who's on a prepayment meter. So the utilities could tell those 8 million households extremely quickly, certainly within the 5 weeks, and none of them would have to claim.
Okay. We've got a question from Chris O'Donnell from Utilita. It was recently announced that no new applications were received to build wind farms. I'm not sure if that was offshore. I think there might have been offshore, because the price companies could charge for the energy was set at too low a rate. So how would this work with your proposal green power pool?
I'd make sure that the next auction, and I think it's already been announced, the next auction, I think it's number 6, which is coming up next year, will be at a higher rate. So there'll be many more new offshore wind farms coming into the pipeline after that. Okay.
Finally, JB, I'm not sure who JB is, but my feeling is the electric-only households should not be subjected to a 4,200 cap, as this is too low in many cases. So it wouldn't ensure that they get, this would also ensure they get more like 1,000, not 500 total, so fairer.
Yes, I don't think I've adequately answered all electric households. I'd have to do a bit more thinking about it.
Okay.
Fair point.
Well, thanks. Well, look, I think time's pressing on, so we better move on to our next presentation. Thank you very much, Brenda. Excellent as ever. So we next have David Southgate from Age UK. David Southgate is Age UK's energy policy leader. He's heading up the charity's development of solutions to the energy price crisis and the wider cost of living crisis. He's worked at Age UK since 2021 and designed its proposal for a targeted discount energy deal or social tariff. Over to you, David.
Thanks, William, and hi, everyone. Yes, so I'm going to go through our proposals for a discount energy tariff. It's often referred to as a social tariff. The two things are the same, really, same side of the different coin. Age UK is a leading national charity for older people, but to be clear, we're proposing this tariff would benefit those of all ages and would be UK-wide, so it would include Northern Ireland as well. Graham, if you go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So the way I'm going to go through the social tariff here is basically answering the key questions that we asked ourselves about how it could work, who would benefit, how much it would cost, and how we can make progress on it, really. So I'm going to go through each of these, and I'd be happy to answer any follow-up questions anyone has afterwards as well. Next slide, Graham. So at its basics, what is a targeted discount energy deal? If you go to the next slide, Graham. So as I said, it's the same as a social tariff, so it's the same proposal. One of the reasons that we refer to it as a targeted discount tariff is effectively it's just a targeted version of the existing energy price guarantee that's been in place for the last year or so. The key thing that a social tariff or a discount tariff does is it just provides a discount on the unit rate for those who are eligible, and it's targeted at those who are in greatest need. That's all it is in essence. So if you took the energy price guarantee, focused it on those who are in greatest need in the energy market, that's basically what we're trying to do. But we're aiming for a really substantive, generous discount to make it really make a difference to fuel poor households. It's targeted at those in greatest need, which means it has to be those who are both on and off the welfare benefit system. And I'll show a table in a minute to explain why that's so important, but you can't just rely on focusing on the benefit system, as I know Brenda's also just mentioned in her own presentation there. One of the other key components that we're really keen on is making sure that wherever possible, it's automatic. And again, this is where we share something with Brenda. We want to make sure that it goes on to the unit rate that you have on your meter instead of it being provided as a cash incentive, and making sure that that's automatic wherever possible, so you don't have to fill out a complicated application form, as that can make attrition from things like the warm home discount far higher. We want it to be universal across suppliers. We wouldn't want any unfair competition where some suppliers are enrolled and others aren't, as this could not only exclude some people who are with smaller suppliers, for instance, but it could also create distortions in the market. We want it to sit alongside existing consumer protections. So it's important to remember the great work that's already being done by winter fuel payment, the warm home discount, and other affordability schemes in the market. And we don't want to see the social tariff replace them. We want to see it complement them instead. And importantly, it's about supporting all eligible consumers. So we want to make sure that the delivery mechanism supports people on fixed tariffs, as well as those default tariffs, and also people on alternative fuels, so oil, coal, bottled gas, and non-domestic residential households, so people in care homes, people in park home sites as well. Thanks, Graham. Next slide. So what's the eligibility criteria and who would benefit? Next slide, Graham. So on the right here, you've got 3 different eligibility criteria. The key one that Age UK is proposing is actually that third one, which is based on both the benefit system. So that's anyone who's in receipt of a means tested benefit, mainly universal credit and pension credit. Anyone who's in receipt of a disability benefit. So again, mainly attendance allowance, DLA and PIP, and anyone as well who's in receipt of carers allowance. Those are the benefit criteria. Then on top of that, we want to go beyond just using that benefit system and look at everyone who is in poverty or just above the poverty line. And that's why we look at those who are below 70% of median after-tax income with their household income. So we've got all those people who are in poverty as well. And one of the ambitions really of the social tariff is to increase and improve data matching so that we can do that for those people who aren't in receipt of benefits. And again, I'd be happy to talk about that more at the end if useful. If you move on to the next slide. So why is it important to target people who are not in receipt of benefits? So this point's really, really key to us. And if you go to the next slide, Graham. And the reason for it is we know with existing schemes, especially the warm home discount, a lot of people miss out because they're struggling on a low income, but they're not in receipt of benefits. This table here is broken down by income decile. So on the left, you have the people on the very lowest income, so that's number 1, and then people all the way up to the very highest incomes, and that's number 10. Next to that, you have eligibility criteria 1. So just for clarity, that's people who are in receipt of means tested benefits. That's if you just focus the social tariff on means tested benefit recipients. And what it shows is the people on the very lowest incomes, 46% of them, nearly half, would miss out on the tariff if you're just using benefits. So that's why it's so key from our perspective to go beyond that and look at eligibility criteria 2 and 3, which use better data matching to try and deliver the tariff to those who are off the benefit system as well, because otherwise you're not reaching all of the fuel poor in the process of putting this in place. Next slide, please, Graham. How much would that cost? So if you go to the next slide, sorry, Graham. So it depends. Our tariff is based on a unit rate discount. And the reason for that is it means that the amount of discount that you get scales based on the amount of energy that you need for your needs. And that's particularly important for people in lower energy efficient homes that have higher costs, and also people with medical equipment, for instance, who have higher costs. That means that the cost of the tariff will fluctuate slightly based on the underlying cost of energy. So what I've done here is show you how much it costs based on different levels of discount if underlying bills are at £2,100. So that's an annual energy bill of £2,100. If the discount was 50%, so trying to discount half of the bill for all those who are eligible, and just for context, if you include those eligibility criteria I talked about earlier, that's about 10 to 11 million of the most vulnerable households. So if you discount their bills by 50%, then it would cost about £10.8 billion. If you discount them by 30%, then it's 6.5, and 10% is more around that £2 billion mark. If you go to the next slide, please, Graham. So this is one of the reasons why it's really important that we have a progressive funding mechanism to make sure that that cost isn't borne out by those who are unable to pay it and actually should be in receipt of the social tariff itself. If you go to the next slide, Graham. So if it's funded through general taxation, this issue is much better addressed because you've got a progressive funding mechanism in place to address it. But this is to show basically what happens if you don't. So if you don't and you levy that cost onto consumer bills, then because of the 10 million people who are benefiting from it, you could see increases in costs for everyone else's bills to pay for that cost. And to an extent, that makes sense because you'd want people on higher incomes to help subsidize the cost of those on lower incomes. But caught up within that as well are going to be a lot of people who are still struggling with their costs and therefore aren't able to pay the additional costs associated with the tariff. What this table basically shows is, again, if you have a 50% discounted tariff, you could add £610 to a customer's bill. And then it goes all the way down there to that 10% discount being £120. And that's why, from Age UK's perspective, is really, really important that this is funded through government and funded through general taxation, or that the government massively improve its ability to data match so that it's supporting people, again, who are off the benefit system. And then they won't be forced to bear that additional cost. Oh, sorry, someone's got their mic off. Oh, Lorenzo, if you just mute, sorry. That was gone. Sorry. Next slide. Why a unit rate discount? If you go to the next slide. Lorenzo, if you could just mute, sorry.
Ok. Guarda, nel senso, non è che abbia fretta.
Graham, I don't know if you can mute.
Forse può essere la stessa cosa di Teams, no? Che avendo un esterno.
No, accesso di dare io.
Ok.
No worries if not.
Sì, guarda quando.
Lorenzo, I don't know if you can hear me, but if you're able to mute.
Per caso 31-12-2003. No, è arrivata con richiesta di rinnovo.
Oh, there we go. Thanks very much. Thank you. If you go back to the presentation, Graham. Sorry about that. Yeah, so very, very quickly, if you, oh, I've got a different slide view, Graham, so it's gone to a different one. Oh no, it's still there. Yeah, so very, very quickly, why is it important to have a unit rate discount? So the graph that you can see there shows if you're in the lowest energy efficiency properties, so if you're in EPC bands F and G, you pay more than double generally than those who are in EPC's band A to C. And that's why a unit rate discount for a social tariff is important, because it means that your energy costs and the discount that you get scale to your actual need. So if you're in one of those lower energy efficiency properties, you're not getting a fixed discount that everyone else would get. You're getting it based on your need. That's also really important for people who have medical equipment. We know that right now, many people who have medical equipment at home are paying upwards of £8,000 on their annual bill. So if the discount doesn't scale to their use, then unfortunately it just doesn't touch the sides. So it's really important to try and have that unit rate discount wherever possible as well. If you go to the next slide, Graham. What progress has been made? So if you go to the final slide, sorry, Graham. So this is just really to give you an update on what progress has been made and what, oh, you've got some, I think the slides aren't popping up at full size, Graham. I think we've got some people in the chat just. I think you have to swap display like the presentation view, Graham, if you. Don't worry if it's not coming up. Oh no, it's coming. Yeah, anyway, so yeah, if you stay on that slide, sorry, Graham. So yeah, it's I think it's just not full size, but don't worry. I can send the slides around afterwards for anyone who wants to have a look. In terms of what progress has been made, so originally in the autumn statement 2022, there was actually a nod to the social tariff. So they suggested that they would look at longer term reform, and social tariffs were mentioned as one of the options. In January 2023, 95 non-profit organisations, some of which I'm sure are on this call, called on the government for a joint letter to consult on a social tariff, and commitments were made by the government to do so with a consultation hoped for over the summer, and they made promises that would occur. When we got to September, no consultation was launched, but over 140 organisations, actually including some MPs, signed a further coalition letter to try and again call for that consultation. Since then, we have heard some assertions that the longer term options are still being reviewed, but I think given that the general election's coming up next year, our concern is that things have really stalled, to be honest. There wasn't any mention of a social tariff in the 2023 autumn statement or longer term tariff reform in general, which was a real disappointment. Our next steps from AGK's perspective is joint working in the new year to keep pressure on the government to put forward that consultation. We think it's still really important that that consultation is put in place, even if we don't know whether the government can implement it immediately, because we think we'll give that impetus for whoever's in power after the next election to really hit the ground running with it. The spring budget, so we'll be putting in submissions around the social tariff there, and the focus slightly switches to manifestos as we try and put more emphasis on opposition parties as well. And then, yeah, that's great. Any questions anyone has, happy to answer them. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David. Just a quick question for me. I wasn't quite sure how you would identify people in the eligibility groups 2 and 3. You've said data matching, but essentially it sounded like you would need information on people's income to be able to find those people.
Yeah, so there's a few options that we looked at. So we looked at combining basically some of the stuff that's being done with the warm home discount, which has some benefits and obviously some drawbacks as well. There's been some progress in terms of how that works, although at the same time with the ones who are missed, there's a lot of bespoke work going on to try and plug those gaps. So flawed, but still working slightly better than it was previously. On the energy company obligation as well, the government already have some data matching proxies in place. All sorts of things that can better identify stuff like social prescribing, NHS referrals, and those sorts of things. Again, in practice, they haven't all got off the ground yet, but we're hoping a combination of those two will help get us further towards better targeting. And then ultimately, it's a complete reform of how we do data across government. So we've had some really positive conversations in terms of what could be done with HMRC data, DWP data, data from DESNZ itself, and data from suppliers and smart meters, that potentially, if you could bring that all together, would get us much closer to where we'd want to be with it. We're not there fully with it yet, but that's part of why this consultation in our mind is so important, so we can move beyond just the database stuff that we're doing at this point, which is mainly benefits driven.
And does the legislation already exist to allow that level of data matching?
It depends, not really. There would require some changes, mainly again, because you're, like you said, William, you're looking at income data, and it does require some changes there. But again, I don't think that's beyond what we should be looking at this point, because I think we really need to look at how we can better do that. And if legislation is required, then yeah, I think it's worth pushing for it.
I have a question from Sana Marklenin from University of Cambridge. I think I mean, she's referring to wealthy pensioners who get, support, for instance, from winter fuel payments and so on, and how they could direct funds to those who do need it. And she suggested that currently the only way they can do this is perhaps give it to charity to support homeless people. I think there have been schemes where specifically targeted at people receiving winter fuel payments. I think classically, I mean, this always used to come up, this debate about the universal nature of winter fuel payments at the Fuel Poverty Advisory Group. I remember that we always fell into two groups. I was one of those supporting universal provision. I always felt the solution was to address it through a tax system. But I wonder if you've got any particular suggestions about this issue.
Yeah, so it all comes back to the data matching. Again, the reason universal is so important is because we just don't have a system in place that can get it to all the people who need it most. With pensioners in particular, about a third of them, so pension credit is the main welfare benefit for pensioners who are struggling on a lower income. About a third of everyone who's eligible for that doesn't claim it. It's nearly 1 million older people. So the problem is, if you take away the universal component and move towards targeting, you're missing about a third of the most vulnerable older people out of that situation. And it's similar with universal credit if you don't have universal measures there. So I think universal is really, really important. It's a much needed payment. In terms of what people can do with it, I think I know a lot of older people, a lot of pensioners do donate it to charity. I think the problem we've seen in the past is sometimes people who really do need that money have then donated it to charity as well. So from our perspective, it's a difficult balance because we don't want to encourage people to give it away if they need it. If they're able to and can afford their bills, then it's a different situation. So it really depends on their individual circumstances, to be honest.
And I see there's somebody's raised their hand, Matilda Reynard. So Graham, can you unmute Matilda, allowed to ask her question direct? Thank you. Can't hear you very well, Matilda.
Can you not hear me?
Just about. I can just about hear you.
Give it a shot.
Oh no, not anymore.
Nothing at all. Sorry, you're now on mute, Matilda. Is there any chance of putting it in the chat? Okay, hopefully we might be able to get the question. I think there's something from Neil Simcock. Resolution Foundation produced a report arguing for a social tariff to go, well, to go beyond only those on welfare. However, for this to work, they said there would need to be a new application process, at least in the short term.
Yeah, so
Thoughts on that?
this it again comes back to the radical change you'd need in data matching. There would likely have to be grades of where we get to of each stage. So the data matching I mentioned with the energy company obligation and the warm home discount, that's relatively easy to implement quite swiftly. In fact, probably in the immediate aftermath of the social tariff, we could implement that in scheme year 1, I would think. It won't be perfect though, so you then want more than that. And at that point, I think an application system as a stand-in might be a necessary component to complement it as well. But again, it's ultimately trying to move towards a situation where we're not just focused on the benefit system, because that's really where the biggest issues lie with it, to be honest.
I mean, of course, with the warm home discount, that's largely now automatic, hasn't it? And I think many of us think that's been a big improvement, although it still requires based on benefit system. I think hopefully, Mathilde, if you can put your question in the chat. Oh, here we go. Right. So Mathilde's asked how she's wondering how you came about the recommendations from places mainly working with pensioners. Could you, I presume, in terms of thinking about, the wider groups you were saying should refer it to, could you sort of talk through that, how you arrived at that approach?
Process? So it mainly came about from the warm home discount. And to be honest, the flaw with the warm home discount. Now, the WHD is a really great scheme. It does provide a tremendous benefit. And if you're in receipt of pension credit, it's actually much easier to access than if you're in receipt of universal credit. So it works quite well for most pensioners. The problem is, we heard from a lot of older people who are in very energy inefficient homes, who are paying, even before this crisis, sort of £3,000 on their bills to cover their costs. And a lot of older people who are relying on medical equipment or assistive technology, so stair lifts and those sorts of things, who have far higher bills than the average. And the problem is the warm home discount, which at the time was £140, it didn't scale. It stayed fixed at that £140. So really that was the problem that we were seeing. And the problem we were having reported to us is, I have much higher costs than the average person, but there isn't any support that scales to my needs. So that's really where our view and our sort of support for the social tariff derive from, is trying really to help those people.
Thank you, David. I think we better move on to the next speaker now, but thank you very much, David. Really interesting.
Thanks.
So we next have Alex Chapman from New Economics Foundation, who's going to talk about their proposals for the National Energy Guarantee. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you. Thanks for having me along. Yeah, so New Economics Foundation is a charitable, non-party political think tank. If you're interested in how we are funded, please do take a look at our website, because I think that's important when you're dealing with think tanks. And yeah, so I'm going to talk about our proposals for a national energy guarantee. To simply describe what it is, I mean, the technical term for the model is a rising block tariff. For the people on the call who are familiar with that language, we don't use it because it's not very accessible. But the simple idea is that the rate or the price per kilowatt hour or per unit of energy that is consumed in the household is charged at different rates depending on your level of consumption. Now, our preferred model in NEF is that there is an initial free block of energy that every household should receive. And then the proposal potentially suggests that there would be a slightly higher premium charge on what you might term excessive levels or very high levels of consumption. Now that model of billing is not revolutionary. It's used in other countries and it's used in other sectors for different public goods. Perhaps the most interesting or relevant parallel is its use in California as the energy billing system there. And in Germany, it was introduced to an extent throughout the recent crisis. When they introduced their support to bills, they reduced the cost of an initial block of energy as opposed to all energy consumption, which is the way it was done in the UK through the energy price guarantee. Now, you can approach the idea from different ideological perspectives. At NEF, we believe in universal basic services, and therefore ideally we're looking for a world in which the essentials for a good standard of living are provided to every individual and every household for free, whether that be healthcare, education, water, or energy. And we see the rising block tariff model, the national energy guarantee, as perhaps a step towards that direction. But interestingly, the policies also receive some support from other parts of the political spectrum. Right-wing think tanks have supported it, principally on the basis that the current market is failing. And in instances where you've got a failing market, such as one that has required such extreme intervention from the government over the last 2 years, then you have two options. One is to try to implement fixes to that market, concepts such as a social tariff, which essentially plug the holes of the individuals who are slipping through or being hurt by that market. Or you can take the more radical option of reforming it and reforming the structure of that market, which is to some extent what our proposal does. I would at times the proposal is framed as if you like, a kind of rival to a social tariff model. I actually don't like that framing because it isn't. Virtually any monetized system related to a public good involves some form of social tariff, because most systems are imperfect. Whether that be free prescriptions handed out on the NHS to certain groups, or social tariffs that are used in water markets. Ultimately, markets usually, or government delivery mechanisms, especially involving charging for public goods, usually have failures and require some form of sticking plaster. But the question at stake here is, how large should that fix need to be? If your group on fuel poverty, depending on the definition you look at, is reaching up to 30-40% of the population, then you've got a really problematic structural failing. And of course, before the recent crisis, there were unacceptably high levels of fuel poverty before we got into the mess that we're in now as a result of a various variety of factors, but obviously the price spikes that we've seen recently. So the proposal is, I'll share my screen to summarize slightly better visually now. Hopefully you can all see this. Now this first slide sets up some of what I see as being some of the strengths of this structural reform to the market. So the first principle is that every household has a safety net level of energy consumption that they can access either for free, depending on how you set up your model, or for a very large discounted rate. Our preferred model pegs that level of delivery to the essential needs of a household. Now, you can't do that perfectly because every household is different, but you can at least put the level at something that you believe is likely to deliver a reasonable standard of living, or at least just to keep people alive, for either free, as I say, or a low amount. And as a result of the shift, even if you then charge higher tariffs on higher levels of consumption, with a cost neutral model, that's where you cross subsidize that cheaper tariff with the more expensive tariff, you can end up with a large reduction in the number of the vulnerable population that you've got through that cross subsidization process. Now, I'm not, for reasons that we've heard already today, I'm not necessarily a big fan of relying fully on that cross-subsidization, because there will be people in the high consumption side of this who would pay significantly more potentially. So I would favour a situation where the government actually put in some additional funding to fund some of the free allocation, or the minimum energy supply. But of course, actually, what you can do here is you can have a lot of control over the policy in terms of how you flex your levels. We have modelled the free allocation model, but actually you can have much softer gaps between the cheapest band and the most expensive one. So in California, it isn't as they don't have a free band of energy; they just have a lower tariff and a higher tariff, and the gap between the two can vary. Broadly speaking, whenever you make that split between lower and higher tariffs, you do end up with a progressive distribution of benefits. So broadly speaking, the poorer will benefit more because by and large they consume less energy, than the wealthier. If you have a smaller gap, then it's a less aggressive policy. There's less risk of large losers, of large people who consume large amounts of energy. But there's also not such a strong safety net. So it's all a trade-off between those two drivers. But one of the most interesting elements, which we've not really heard talked about, I think, in the previous presentations, is what your energy billing system does for the incentives to decarbonize the economy, or meet our climate change targets and the like. Now, obviously, typically when you apply some sort of correction and subsidy to the system, you create an incentive which potentially can be counterintuitive or counterproductive on the climate aims, because you're making energy cheaper where that energy might potentially either be being consumed inefficiently because homes are not efficient enough, or might be coming from fossil fuels. By splitting your tariffs in this way, what you end up with is protection on consumption at the essential level, but also a very significant increase in the incentive to install insulation and solar panels at the premium end. So, for example, if your premium tariff was 20 to 30% higher than the market average, you've just increased the incentive and the return on investment, more or less, not directly, but by about 20 to 30% on installing insulation and solar panels. And that could be potentially very, very helpful to driving what you might call able to pay groups in the population, the wealthier households, to accelerate the transition and install those measures. Other examples from around the world also suggest that the model does slightly reduce your demand in the overall system because of the greater penalization of higher consumption. And that is potentially going to be very useful to us as we transition to this all-electric system, putting aside the debate about hydrogen for now, but the all-electric system is pretty much where we're heading. That is going to put strain on the grid, and at times of very high peak demand, if those conflict with times of low solar power or wind power, there are going to be demand challenges. So a shift to a system that has slightly more, a greater incentive to reduce demand could be potentially beneficial, particularly when we start talking about the direction of the transition involving things like electric vehicles, whether we want to have widespread usage of electric vehicles, or we want to put incentives towards public transport, for example. The model in itself, as I've described it, just simply splitting the tariffs, is not actually particularly complicated. In fact, we already have the architecture to do it, in the sense that we have a price cap that's being set, which sets your a standard tariff. But why not just have the price cap being set, for example, on the essential energy use as opposed to the entire bill? So once a year, or however frequently you want to do it, the government could say, right, the suppliers must deliver 2,000 kilowatt hours of energy for 20p to everyone in the country, and that is what the supplier has to work to, and then competition can exist at the tariffs higher than that, at the higher levels. We would also argue that making this structural change to the system makes your targeting of emergency support, social tariffs, whatever you want to call it, much easier if you do enter a crisis period. Now, if we look at where we've just been with extremely high energy prices, that would still hurt in a rising block tariff model, such as our national energy guarantee. It's hard to avoid that hurting if it's a market system. However, at the moment, we saw over the last few years a system where supports were given fairly universally, in the sense that either it was a fixed cash payment, which went to everyone, which meant that households that were actually not really very exposed to this and consumed very low amounts of energy received a large cash payment, even if they weren't that vulnerable. And similarly, when you have the measure on the unit rate, so the energy price guarantee fixed the unit rate at a certain level, the benefits of that fix still went disproportionately, well, not in proportion to households that were not consuming much energy, still received a discount. Whereas in this model, what you can do is you can target your support measures in an extreme crisis situation at the premium tariff, which means you can either fix the tariff, subsidize it, whatever you want to do. And by doing so, all you do is subsidize help or support to those high consumers that you've decided during this crisis period are in need of support. So your targeting can become much more efficient. In relation to targeting also, we envisage the model as being a system that might support a wider program around retrofit and home upgrades. So, for example, if your supplier gives you a warning as a resident that you're about to enter, or this year you're likely to enter the premium tariff rate, they can also send you that information with a guide, or even send over a retrofit coordinator to help you to take measures to avert that. And again, we see that as a potentially positive incentive. But like every system, it's not without its weaknesses. So as I've said, we reckon that social tariffs are still likely to be required, because through the shift of the structure, you don't eliminate fuel poverty entirely. And particularly, your concern is about low-income households, but are consuming high amounts of energy and they're not doing that sort of excessively. They don't physically have the ability to reduce their consumption. Now, exactly who that group is a key question. Now, within our modelling, we're pretty confident that you can address a lot of that problem by first giving for example, additional free allocation of energy to everyone who's got a disability. You can also allocate an additional chunk of energy to anyone who has children in the household. And also you can do quite a lot if you wanted to protect, for example, people on benefits from the premium tariff. Those would all be pretty straightforward and simple tweaks to make to put some protections in. But that leaves behind a small group of still low-income individuals with high consumption that I think as a society we probably need to find out exactly what their situation is. But it's quite likely that that group are people living in very poor quality or very poorly insulated housing stock, which again is a wider challenge that is not going to be addressed just as a part of this proposal, but needs to be addressed anyway. It's a fundamental issue that needs to get tackled. So we had in our latest publication, my last one, and then I'll shut up, we looked a little bit more in detail at that particular problem. The first thing we found is that group of concern are very highly geographically concentrated in certain areas. The map on the right shows Leeds and Bradford. On the right, what you see, every highlighted area is an area of high deprivation in the bottom 10% of the country. But on the right-hand side, you see the Leeds housing stock, which is fairly well insulated, and therefore energy consumption is not too high. And therefore, they wouldn't be a group that would be exposed by this type of mechanism. And on the left, you see Bradford, which has pretty widely very poor housing stock and poorly insulated homes. But we, as I say, here we would look to address that through a street-by-street retrofit approach that is going to need to happen anyway in Bradford to deal with that particular issue. But through this targeting measure and aligning the rollout of a scheme like this to retrofit needs, but also phasing the introduction so that households have time to respond independently, that's what this table shows here. We think that there's a way of rolling out this type of system with a very small number of overall losers from the policy, or at least certainly a very small number who come from a group who can't afford to make changes and improve their energy efficiency. So, for example, in the table, you can see you could just split to start with into two bands, and you could just initially cut the lower band by 5%. Not a big saving on the current bill, but just as an introductory level, with no losers, with no increase to the upper band. And we think that's important because with any measure, particularly climate measures, we think that the carrot should come before the stick. And of course, it has a cost to government, but that cost is not particularly large because the discount is not so large. Then in the next year, you could start to introduce that differentiation. So the upper band price goes up 5%, the lower band goes down 15%. That introduces a group of households in the lower income levels of around 1% who become losers from the policy, and they become your retrofit targets. Those are the houses that you need to go out and you need to get retrofitted. Either the individuals can do it by flagging themselves to a government support system, or the government needs to go street by street in the target areas to get those houses done in 1 year. First wave is only 66,000. And then you can see in the subsequent years that as you split the bands, you increase the differentiation between the cheaper and the more expensive bands. The number of potential losers does grow, only reaching 10% of the population by the end of the 5-year period, which would involve retrofitting 600 to 700,000 homes. Now, as I say, our view is that is a direction of travel that needs to happen anyway. But what is not shown on this graph, and I think what I would reiterate, is that at the same time as going through this process, on the other side, you have potentially an overall halving of the number of households that are in fuel poverty, because the structure of the system itself is actually set up to benefit the vast majority of households. In fact, typically, depending on how you set your levels of your tariff bands, anything from 70 to 80% of the population, sometimes even 90%, are winners from the policy. So your overall group in need shrinks significantly from where you are at the moment, which is where a social tariff potentially needs to reach anything from 20 to 40% of the entire population. You immediately save yourself a lot of that work by this structural shift. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Alex. I'm aware that we're running out of time, but just a quick question then, if I could put to you. I mean, I think it probably, of the different proposals we've heard so far, yours probably represents most far-reaching shake-up of the current energy system. And of course, we have seen, like you said, some extensive government interventions in recent times with both the energy price guarantee and energy bill support scheme. But what do you think are the proposals, are the prospects for bringing about the reforms you'd like to see?
Well, I mean, as we heard from David, I mean, the government hasn't even brought forward the consultation it promised on a social tariff. So in that context, any positive steps seem a little far away at the moment. However, in terms of general support for a more structural change, we see that support as being fairly strong. As I say, there is cross-party support, within the sort of people that we're working with. We've got Tories, we've got Labour. We know Labour's interested. Labour are looking at this from what they call I think a sort of energy as a service kind of lens, which is a slightly different framing, but nonetheless includes some of the same principles. So we think that there is political buy-in from potentially groupings within both sides. And I don't think it's a particularly hard sell to anyone in the sector to say that the current structures are just not working. If you look at the amount of government time and wider stakeholders that's been exhausted by trying to fix and fiddle around with the current system over recent years, I think the need for it is understood. A number of the consultations we've seen from different groups, including the currently open consultation from Ofgem, do ask questions about the rising block tariff, so it clearly is on people's minds. But yeah, it's fair to say that we're probably further away from delivering that level of structural reform than we are from potentially getting a social tariff, even if that feels a little far away at the moment as well.
Thank you. I think David and Matilda have asked similar questions about sort of political support. David's also asked about, is there any way, any thoughts on exempting high energy users who need medical equipment from paying that higher rate?
So my understanding is, I mean, you'd absolutely want to make sure they're exempted from that. Anyone with a medical reason certainly shouldn't be paying a premium tariff. But my understanding was that type of, I mean, that's a kind of form of social tariff, that there was some progress on that already. I don't know, I'm not an expert on that domain, but I don't know if it's currently rolled out or it's in the process potentially of being trialed. Someone else on the call might know, but that there is plans for some form of prescribing of energy discounts to people with medical needs.
I mean, I think they should be on the priority service register, of course, anyway. I think we better move on because I very keen to hear from a final speaker. Thank you, Alex. So I just introduced Ruth London. Ruth London is from Fuel Poverty Action. And we thought it'd be useful to hear from an activist who's very much focused on campaigning for change. Ruth is a founder member of the Fuel Poverty Action, which started in 2012 and is currently an active director of the organisation. And although too modest to say, I think she's been a major driver of the organisation's recent growth and visibility. She's a grandmother, has a long history of activism, including the Climate Camp, Occupy London, the Women's Movement, and Green and Common. So thank you very much, Ruth. Over to you.
Thanks very much, William. I'm going to try and rip through the first part of this. Partly I'm having a bit of trouble speaking because I broke all my teeth a few days ago, which also means I might want some help from my colleague Jonathan, who's JB, in answering questions. We have a lot in common, there's obviously is a lot in common between all the different proposals and a lot of shared motivation. And particularly for us with the rising block tariff, as Alex has described it. I just want to focus on some differences. For those who are not familiar with Energy for All, it is a form of rising block tariff. It goes a bit further in some respects. We definitely start with it being free for what people need, defined in terms of, heating, lighting, washing, cooking, the basics, and paying more for wastage stroke luxury use beyond need. And this premium for people's swimming pools and mansion houses, etc., would partly fund the free band of energy. Our first concern is security. We've had people objecting to the fact that it's universal, especially when they haven't looked at it very carefully, because they say, look, money's going to some people who don't need it, and that there'd be more money for people in need if everything was targeted. But if you look at Energy for All more carefully, you actually see that most people with high incomes would be paying more than they do now, not less, because of the higher unit tariff. And universality, it obviously has the advantage that no one slips through the net. Plus, importantly, I think a huge benefit in terms of social cohesion. Some of the people who've been most keen putting it forward have been pensioners who were involved in the 20th century movements against means testing that established, the NHS, council housing, a general entitlement culture, very different to the present food bank mentality, where you basically have to be totally destitute before you can access, I won't say help, but before you can access common resources. We're really glad that the social tariff model that's being put forward by David and others, that it goes further than passporting to means-tested benefits. That's crucial. I'm a bit confused by David saying that being universal is important. We absolutely agree, but it seems to me that social tariff isn't really universal. It is very far-reaching, which is an advantage, but I think it's unfortunate that no one would trust the present government, or I have to say the present opposition, to not fall back on the usual route when it comes to spending public money, of saying, oh, we're going to make sure we target the neediest and the most deserving poor. We can't forget that they've been quite content to let people die when they don't turn their heat on or can't top up their prepayment meter. And I'm sure you all are aware of the huge numbers now, even with this cold snap, that are not using heating at all. So no one falls through the cracks. I think the Don't Pay movement, which was huge, reflected the response of people who are not the poorest, who agree that no one should be destitute, but they're also asking, what about me? I'm not destitute, but I also don't want to be cold. A key element, which we differ somewhat from NEF on this, a key element is that our version of rising block tariff for Energy for All takes account of different situations from the get-go, which means that in assessing what a basic need is, you include power for wheelchairs and stair lifts, and you take account of household size and housing conditions. And that does mean an audit. And again, like free energy, there's a kind of knee-jerk reaction, oh, that's impossible, not realistic. But it's actually not so wild, since we already have the EPC. The government knows everybody's employment status, benefits, children, a lot about our health. And we have green doctors who go around house to house where there's problems and assess energy efficiency to make sure that people are getting all the benefits they're entitled to. Our view is that if the government is serious about meeting needs, it has to find out what they are. And that is on a kind of door-to-door basis, like you do when you do canvassing for an election. And that has to include housing, which has to be assessed anyway, the housing need and the need for refurbishment. And that's part of the agenda of everybody on this call anyway. So we have our Energy for All manifesto, which has 5 points in it. I hope you'll all look at it online. Jonathan, maybe you want to stick it in the chat. It includes retrofitting and dealing with a whole slew of injustices in pricing and prepayment meters and so on. But retrofitting in particular is not just a bolt-on, it's integral to Energy for All, because once the government is responsible for ensuring that people don't freeze, suddenly they'll discover that insulating the UK's housing stock is actually affordable after all, because it won't be us but them that's picking up the unaffordable cost of not having it. So that's number one. The second difference is that it's to do with climate change, really. Aside from the rising block tariff, the money, aside from payment premium prices on people using more, the money for Energy for All is to come from fossil fuel profits via windfall taxes and completely ending fossil fuel subsidies. People are very aware that the corporations have made hundreds of billions from inflated energy prices, and they want that money back. And people know that we are not getting it back from the current system of windfall taxes come loopholes. Instead, money has been going to these corporations from the public purse, including via our bills. And that's important. The fossil fuel industry seem to think that they have us over a barrel. They think they've got it sewn up because the government has to choose between letting people freeze to death or subsidizing the massive bills that they impose on us. And when they do subsidize our bills, the money goes straight into their coffers. It's like they have direct access to the public purse. And the money that they get goes into either lining pockets that are very well lined to begin with, or into further developing fossil fuels, and round we go again with more of the same problem. So it shouldn't be surprising that firms like Centrica support a social tariff that they feel helps protect their profits. It means billions more in public funds to subsidize their inflated pricing. And what's going to stop them from then putting it up yet further, like the 40 billion of public funds that ended up with the energy firms last winter. So the third difference is that it's wildly popular. I think, the social tariff has more support from energy companies. We just have ecotricity. And it had the government indicating that they would pick it up, which they have not done. But at least they've given indication, which is more than they've done for Energy for All. And it has support from organizations that have been struggling for decades to mitigate poverty and working out the best ways of doing that. And we absolutely respect that. But Energy for All has been picked up by organizations that are way beyond the charity sector, all sorts of grassroots groups, from barge dwellers to single mothers. It started with our own membership, having strong debates among, we're a very diverse group of people in terms of, age, income level, education, and so on, and discussed it heatedly among ourselves. And it got huge enthusiasm from a very different constituency from those that, normally consider these questions. The petition got, 6-figure endorsements overnight, and ended up with 651,000 signatures when we gave it in. The move had 75% in a poll. The TUC has backed it. Unite Community has a campaign called Unite for Energy for All, and there are grassroots members in, I think it's over a dozen towns and cities, holding warm-ups and other direct action events as part of their campaign this weekend, together with people from all sorts of other groups, pensioners groups, and grassroots organizations all over the country as part of Fuel Poverty Action's weekend of action now. So that's 2 points of difference from most, not from the rising block tariff, but from most of what's been put forward. And I think they do feed into the fact that people are actually very angry that the money that they need to feed their children is going to increase those gargantuan profits, and they want it back. And they feel that it's common sense that if you use more, you should pay more per unit. And if you use less, as many people cut down to save money, if you use less, you should pay less per unit, which is the opposite of the standing charge. And I hope maybe there'll be questions on it. But, you know, the standing charge is really the reverse of that, where people who even have used nothing at all while they're in hospital come home and can't get anything, can't turn the light on because their prepayment meter demands a huge sum for energy that they haven't used. And the standing charge means that people who are using less are paying more, and everybody feels that that's upside down. And we have to remember also that it's the excess usage, the luxury usage, that is what's driving up the prices for everybody and damaging the planet, because that's what's forcing us to continue using expensive and damaging gas power stations and LPG imports. So energy for all is the opposite of the standing charge. So those basic injustices in relation to the mansion dweller and in relation to energy corporations, that's why we've had people occupying public buildings and demonstrating in the streets for energy for all. I think people are not looking for a sticking plaster and a fix, no matter how welcome and important that might be, and it will be if we can get it. But what people want is a revolution, turning it right side up, where our needs come first. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Great presentation as ever. Just a couple of quick questions. I think we're not going to have any time for much discussion at the end of this, unfortunately. Brenda has suggested we might even think about having a quick vote about which of these proposals we like, but most. But two quick questions. Just in terms of the your reference to the windfall tax, and I mean, you know, and I think there'd be a lot of people who would very strongly support that, but that tends to be just a one-off. So how would you continue to fund this on an ongoing basis? So that's the first question. If I just put both questions at this point, Neil has asked, with the energy audit, is that something, a new audit for every house, or would you build on the existing EPCs?
Quick answer to the second one. I think everybody agrees that the existing EPCs are in many ways not fit for purpose. And it is definitely worth the investment of checking out housing stock properly. Plus, you can then take into account other circumstances of households. So, you know, do the whole thing properly. It's a job. And it is, as I say, worth it if you really want to find out what the need is, not only for support, but for retrofitting. On the windfall tax, clearly, as the prices come down, the windfall tax will come down. But you know, that goes with the prices coming down. There's also the issue of the fact that we're now being charged prices that reflect the price of the most expensive gas, as opposed to the lower cost of renewable energy. And as we escape from that monstrosity, which is also, you know, part of the demand, then the cost, the overall cost, will be reduced, as it will with falling, with increased energy efficiency. There are possibilities for extending windfall taxes on, you know, beyond fossil fuels, and of course, as you know, Alex said, possible combinations of the things that have been put forward today, where there would also be some form of just some form of social tariff, and indeed wealth taxes that could contribute to a mix. I hope that answers the questions enough.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ruth. We are running out of time. Graham, I'm hoping you know how to make this happen, but there seems to people quite like the idea of the vote. Of course, the four different ideas aren't necessarily in opposition, as has been made clear. But if Graham, can you, how are we going to do this? I'm hoping
Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm going to put a link in the chat. Hopefully I've got the terminology correct here. There's 4 options, which I think should be in the order you heard about them, and you can vote for one. If you follow the link, you'll see the options.
And I think
Can we vote for more than one?
It's just one, I'm afraid.
So you have to vote for the one you like most. So Graham, you're putting it in the chat, did you say?
Yeah, can everyone see that?
Not
So
yet.
it's a Menti link, and it will ask you.
I think that's a bit unfortunate because things are different kinds. Like I would vote for Brenda's as a short-term fix.
Yes.
You know.
I think that was a key. I mean, that was certainly, I know in the campaigning for the emergency tariff, that was very much seen as a lot of organisations all came together, even though, you know, we had different thoughts about what we wanted to see in the long term. I think we're just going to. I don't think it's going to. I think probably the technical things of having tried to set up a PR type system for the vote is going to be a bit difficult. So let's just run with how Graham set it up. So I think you just need to click onto the link in the chat.
That's right.
And you only get one vote, I take, Graham.
Yes, that's correct.
So how many votes have we got so far? Well, while we're waiting for those still to come in, can I thank all of our four speakers for excellent presentations. Sorry, this has overrun a good bit, but I think it reflects the level of concern that there is about what many are now calling a broken energy system and the need for change. Graham, have we got?
Yes, I've just put the graph in the chat.
Okay.
So the results are in the order they were on the screen. National Energy Guarantee is one with 9 votes, Discounted Energy Tariff 1 vote, Emergency Tariff 4 votes, and Energy for All Tariff 6 votes.
Very good.
Not a massive sample, we have to say.
So that reflects those who managed to hold on till the end. Thank you all, everybody, for participating in this event and for sending in your questions. Sorry we've had to rush it towards the end. I think it's been really interesting. We hope to continue, encourage more discussion on this. Try and encourage more research into the different options, and more importantly, research actually goes on to influence policy. FPRN holding a summit webinar on, I think, 12th of December, is that right, Graham, on the private rented sector, or 6th of December. Again, a really key issue for fuel poverty. So hope many of you can attend that. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.